This video is indeed rated B for you'd better back on out of here if you don't want spoilers, buddy. Good day, my friends. It has been some time indeed, but you'll be pleased to know that in my absence, I've traveled the length and width of Tural. While I may be a storyteller at heart, I, like many of you, also count myself as an adventurer. And as such, my wanderlust would not allow me to rest until I was absolutely certain about a variety of interesting things. But now that I've had the chance to rest and pen my discoveries, allow me to begin with the most elementary of lessons, the history of Tural itself. So, once more, let us gather around, my friends, and discuss the legacy of an almost forgotten land, and how it came to be as it is known today. Allow me to tell the tale of Tural and the fledgling culture of Tuliolal. Our research begins with actually a lack of research. While many records within places like Eorzea stated that Tural existed, the actual confirmation that this massive continent was real didn't come around until about 80 years ago. This was when the Lominsan captain known as Ketenram sailed the Indigo Deep and eventually returned with proof of the land's existence, confirming that all of these old tomes were indeed honest, or at the very least, weren't telling complete lies. But the question remains, why? Even countries like Old Sharlayan had already become very advanced and pragmatic when it came to learning more about the nature of our world. So how did an entire continent exist silently for centuries? The answer to that question is twofold. First, the oceans between Aldenard and Tural are notoriously dangerous. Even veteran sailors have met their demise within these waters, and if your vessel accidentally sailed into a hazardous zone known as the Shades Triangle, well, may the 12 have mercy on your soul. Because some sailors have stated that more vessels have been lost to the Shades Triangle than have ever survived. So the difficult waters between these two landmasses already deterred anyone from venturing too far from the mainland. So it stands to reason that without advanced ships that could survive these waters more easily, you're better off staying close to home. Which brings me to the second reason we failed to learn about Tural, and that is due to the people living there themselves. The natives within this continent never wanted to or tried to sail eastward because they themselves were already embroiled in a near constant state of conflict with other tribes upon the land. The continent of Tural itself is massive, which means that many different people with many different ways of thinking were bound to arise. And wherever there are strong differences of opinion, history proves that conflict is guaranteed to follow. In fact, this land has had so many different clans and tribes over the centuries that I failed to document them all. In all honesty, it reminded me much of the Zala tribes upon the lands of Othard. Dozens of unique peoples all living different ways and in different places. This lack of collective norm is why I wasn't able to find much history dating beyond the 6th Astral Era. However, I was able to learn about what happened within the past 1,000 years. So that is where we will start. Our story begins roughly 1100 years ago during an age of abundance with a race of giants known as the Yokhui. To understand how long ago that was, it was at this time that the Elezen of Dravania had already been united by the sacrifice of Saint Shiva and had entered into their golden age of peace with the dragons. However, the peace that these giants had built wasn't created through unity. Theirs was a peace forged in domination. With their immense size and unbridled power, the Yokhui forced all other tribes within Tural under their domain. The giants, for the most part, were remembered as conquerors. By right of conquest did almost the entirety of the continent fall under their rule, and for roughly 100 years or so, they would rule without any true competition. But why? What possessed the Yokui to subjugate their neighbors so fervently? The answer to that question is fear. While the giants were indeed the largest and the strongest living within Tural, there were many that were concerned at the realization of just how many different tribes lived upon the continent. This had intimidated them. After all, history shows that most people are wont to commit acts of violence and depravity long before extending the olive branch. To that end, the giants turned to a preemptive strike to ensure that their people's safety was uninterrupted. This act proved to be, for better or worse, extremely effective. They did indeed conquer most of the continent, and the conquest may have extended to all of Tural if it wasn't for one fateful encounter. Something that would change everything for the Yokui, and eventually dismantle everything that they had built. But this event was not some grand opponent or famous rebellion. It was a dream. Within the forests of Yaktel, the Yokui had already begun using elaborate quarries to mine out the most valuable resources found within this land's caves. But something strange had begun to happen. The giants started to dream of gold. One dreamer became two, then three, and dozens more as time passed, all of them speaking of the same golden dream. What they saw was like something out of a fairy tale. As described by them, it was a heavenly land, suffused with a golden glow. Its people lived as gods, never aging, never dying, free from the hardship of conflict. Every building was a palace, and within their midst was a silent goddess, with a statue so tall that even the mighty Yokui needed to lift their gaze skyward. These dreams drew their minds north, beyond the bounds of Tural, and into the upper half of the continent, Tural. The giants were determined to find this paradise, this idea of heaven, because in their mind, if so many of them had had the exact same dreams, then surely it was a sign that they had been blessed or chosen by whomever lived there. And so, their trail of conquest turned north as they began to march to Tural. Further north, the giants would use their immense size and strength to fashion an outpost of sorts on the northern edge of Tural. This outpost would eventually grow into a temple to honor whatever gods they felt were watching over them. Indeed, this temple would eventually become the capital of Tuliolol many centuries later. So if you ever find yourself walking the streets of Tuliolol, you are treading upon the same grounds that the conquerors of the Yokui carved out many years ago. Once the outpost and eventual temple were built, they turned their attention to the great chasm between Tural and Tural. There's much speculation as to when, why, or how this chasm was formed, but one of the more popular folktales will tell you that it was created when two gods of unbelievable power did battle, causing the very world to be split open. This, of course, brings to mind stories of the Elder Primals, Zodiark, and Hydaelyn. If the theory is to be believed, this chasm was created as a result of their battle. Or maybe, just maybe, this is the precise location with which Hydaelyn delivered her telling blow, sundering not only Zodiark, but the star itself, and all life upon it. But of course, that's just a playful idea. After all, locations like the Ridorana Lighthouse have a similar geological phenomena, and therefore this chasm could be of similar make. Nevertheless, the Yokui were determined to cross this chasm and bravely march into Tural in search of their golden paradise. Eventually, the bridge would indeed be completed, and it was thusly named Zorgor the Boundless. With its completion, the giants continued their conquest, marching into Tural to claim what they saw as divine providence. But all that they would find was their end. After some time passed, the Yokui were forced to retreat back across their mighty bridge in fear, as a pestilence had already ravaged all who dared to travel north. Exactly when or how the giants became afflicted is currently beyond me. All I know for certain is that the toll it took was staggering. Despite their massive size and strength, all it took was something invisible to the naked eye to bring their entire civilization to its knees. To the giants, this disease was extremely contagious, with an even more dangerous lethality rate. For every 10 infected, only about 1 giant would survive, and even the survivors were changed. Those who lived to tell the tale discovered that having children had become much more difficult, and even when they did give birth, their children were smaller and weaker with every generation. This would eventually lead to the Yokui looking as they do today, being much smaller than their ancestors, with only the rare chance now and then that a child will maintain their larger and stronger genetics. This disease, that was likely more of a seasonal allergy to the natives of Tural, had become a death blow to the Yokui. As such, their people retreated to Urkopacha, their homeland, with so few survivors and children that lacked their natural power, they would never be able to rule over Tural the same way ever again. Many of the surviving Yokui looked upon their misfortune and saw the hubris in their actions. In their desire to maintain order, they had taken initiative and struck their neighbors first. But now, as beaten down and reduced as they were, they realized that if they had simply stayed in Urkopacha, they may have very well kept the prosperity that they coveted. But despite this realization, other factions of Yokui looked upon their misfortune with spite, and maintain to this very day the conqueror's mindset, believing that ownership of Tural is their birthright, and they refuse to be denied. The events of this infection, the retreat back to Urkopacha, and the regression of the Yokui occurred roughly 1,000 years ago. And yes, it's around this time that the Dragonsong War had officially begun, after Thordan had betrayed his draconic allies. However, this meant that Tural would enter into a time without Yokui aggression. Their northern temple within Tural would become abandoned, and all the tribes that they had forced into labor were now free to do as they pleased once again. Over the centuries, a degree of normalcy would return to the many tribes of Tural, but now with the stories of a fabled golden city now upon everyone's lips, and how the search for it drove the Yokui to near extinction. This inspired enough fear into the people to ignore the stories of the Golden City and to go back to their daily lives, with only the most brave or foolish taking up the search, and for one reason or another, many of those people would never be seen again. The next stage of notable Turali history wouldn't happen until about 500 years ago. For many generations, the tribes of Mamoja, who had been living within the overly dense southern forests of Yaktel, had been embroiled in many conflicts. The warriors of the Hubigo, the mages of the Bunewa, and the beast tamers of the Dopro were almost always fighting with one another over what little resources their homeland possessed. The quarries made by the Yokui many centuries ago had robbed the land of many valuable metals and minerals. Not only that, but the overly dense forest made growing any kind of crops extremely tedious. A lack of resources and constant food shortages would drive the Mamalja tribes into constant conflict. But roughly 500 years ago, they all began to invade the northern half of Yaktel, which possessed much more fertile and abundant land. A tribe of Hrothgar, known locally as the Shabral, fought hard to defend their land from these new invaders. But even with a similar goal, the tribes of the Mamalja couldn't entirely get along, until the fateful day someone united them all under one banner. Under mysterious circumstances, the first blessed sibling had been born. A Mamalja with 2 heads, granting them incredible strength and superior magical affinity. The power he possessed would convince all the tribes to follow his lead, and so it was that the warring tribes of the Mamalja were finally made one, making the blessed sibling the Mamalja's first true autarch, the leader of their combined people. These intense battles for land within Yaktel started 500 years ago and would last for centuries. For reference, about 500 years ago is when Joran Lightheart had successfully made peace with the elementals of the Black Shroud, causing the once underground people of Gelmora to become the now surface-dwelling country of Gridania. During these centuries of war between the native Hrothgar and the unified Mamalja, a desolate place known as the Shobrit Cinderfield would be formed. It remains to this day as a living testament to the destruction of war, and it was also during these centuries of conflict that many of the tribes we know within Tural today would become their own authorities within their respective lands, creating traditions and ways of life that differed even more fundamentally from one another. These differences began to create friction, and it felt like it was only a matter of time until the violence within Yaktel would start to erupt between other tribes all over the continent. With growing unease and the ever-looming threat of Valigarmanda, the Sky Ruin, who would indiscriminately rampage and destroy entire chunks of land seemingly on a whim, Tural proved to not be a continent in any position to either explore the world or make radical advancements. Which is why, even by modern Eorzean standards, they are still rather tribal. But all of that would change 80 years ago, with the determination of a Rogadin captain and the pilgrimage of a new breed of blessed sibling. It was 80 years ago that Tural would experience one of the most important pivots in the continent's history. And that story begins with a young yet bold Lominsan captain, Ketenram the Blue. I've told this tale many times before, how Ketenram rediscovered the continent of Tural, made friends with the autarch of those lands before returning to Limsa Lominsa with tales of adventure worthy of many a pirate shanty. However, that's not the whole story. In fact, I wasn't even able to get the complete timeline, likely due to how spontaneous Ketenram's arrival was. So I will do my best to weave what we knew into what we now know as best I can. 80 years ago, Ketenram sailed westward in a daring adventure to see what was beyond Eorzea's horizon. It was a difficult journey to be sure, as there are only a few ways to sail the Indigo Deep in relative safety. Nevertheless, he had succeeded where so many others had failed, arriving upon these western shores and the land that we would eventually call the New World. After his arrival, Ketenram would eventually come face to face with the current autarch of the Mamalja, the now famous unifier Galul Jaja. If the original stories are to be believed, Ketenram honored and impressed Galul Jaja by showering him with gifts from Eorzea. But what the stories didn't tell was that Eorzea was just as impressed with all the different tales of the East Ketenram had to tell. Being a captain of Limsa Lominsa means that you've no shortage of stories to spin, so Ketenram regaled Eorzea with stories of his homeland, Eorzea, and many other locations across the world of Hydaelyn. It's likely that these stories left a tremendous impression upon Eorzea, because as long as he had lived, he had borne witness to the conflict and turmoil between the different races and tribes of his homeland. But if many different people from many different backgrounds could come together and form nations across the sea, then why not them? True to the story, Ketenram did receive the Autarch's blessing and traveled across Tural. But again, what the tale didn't say was that he traveled the continent alongside Eorzea for much of his adventure. Theirs was now a bond of brotherhood, and Ketenram would bear witness to many of Tural's greatest changes firsthand. Together, Ketenram and Eorzea would travel the length and width of the continent to meet and parley with a variety of different races and tribes. Their hope was to unite as many people under their banner as possible, though this was easier said than done. Some required more convincing than others, and not all tribes they came into contact with were eager to join in this collective vision. But some did, and as that happened, more and more were inspired to rise up and reach for this new idea of unity and prosperity that they were unfamiliar with. Among their ranks were the wind-driven Hanu, the artistic Moblins, the resourceful Pelu, tribals from Tural, and even the once mighty Yokui themselves. We shall go into greater detail about all these different tribes more at a later date. But what's important to understand is that Eorzea and Ketenram helped to see the entirety of Tural united under a single cause, a shared dream. A dream so bold that it would challenge one of the mightiest monsters in Tural's history, Valigarmanda, the Sky Ruin. This creature is known as a Tural Vidral. It was once a natural beast, but it has lived well beyond its mortal years, gaining a new appearance and devastating powers from its ascension. But instead of becoming wiser and more empathetic like the Auspice of the Far East, Valigarmanda used his new size and strength to rampage like a wild animal. Eorzea and his allies knew that so long as the Sky Ruin roamed free, true peace would be but a pipe dream, as anything new they built would simply be destroyed by this mad monster. But even though Eorzea was mighty, Valigarmanda was mightier still. So instead of a battle of strength, the Sky Ruin was defeated by a battle of wits. They tricked Valigarmanda's own wild and untamed powers to unleash a wave of etheric ice that trapped the Vidral within its own magic. Afterwards, the Yokui themselves elected to stand as vanguard, ensuring that none would ever disturb the beast's prison. In his travels, Eorzea had already accomplished more than most. By parleying and making peace with so many tribes as well as defeating the Sky Ruin, none would fault him were he to decide to end his journey there. But his dream was not yet satisfied. Eventually, he would travel with Ketenram and all his new friends back to his homeland within Yakdel, using what he had learned in his travels to help begin the process of mending a bloody and old grudge. He understood that conflict couldn't evaporate overnight, but unless the first bricks were laid, the road to peace would be untenable. By encouraging the Mamoja and Jabral to break bread with one another, the first signs of tolerance and understanding began to reveal themselves after 500 years of bloodshed. This proved to be one of the greatest acts that solidified the people's opinion of this two-headed warrior. As the autarch, no one would have been surprised if Galul Jaja prioritized the well-being of the Mamuja, and yet, here he was, enriching the lives of all tribes. Through his actions, he refused to play favorites because he honestly believed that a shared prosperity would not only see the Mamuja flourish, but all who lived within Tural. And so it was. After his pilgrimage with Ketenram 80 years ago, the great unity of the continent had been complete, and all the tribes that they had touched during their journey rallied beneath a new banner. As such, a grand new sense of community was born. The now bustling city-state of Tuliolal had been officially created. It was only thanks to the contributions of Tural's many different tribes that this land became so prosperous in relatively a short amount of time. Likely, with the Yokhui's blessing, Galul Jaja would make use of the structures and temples that the giants once built 1,000 years ago, granting them a capital from which to build outward. The Pelu Pelu would use their clever minds to create a fair and equitable economy from which their society might exchange goods and services. The well-crafted trinkets that came from the Moblins helped to detail their lives and create desirable aesthetics. The Hanu Hanu provided their craftsmen and reed farming, while the Jabral had no shortage of hunters and gatherers. Even his own people, the Mamulja, had many skilled fighters and beastmasters, making it so that every tribe had something unique to help prop up their new nation. Galul Jaja was no longer simply the autarch of the Mamulja. Upon his throne within Tuliolal's new palace, he had become known as the Dawn Servant. And so, our story continues as normal. Ketenram would sail the ocean and return to Eorzea with many tales about the autarch, as well as bringing back all sorts of fruits and vegetables from his journey unique to the west. Why he insisted on trying to call this new continent Ketenland is likely a joke that only he knows, but we would come to call it the New World, as Tuliolal had yet to prove that it was truly a new and prosperous nation. But over time, it did. Decades passed, and Tuliolal became more and more of a hub. Some of the Mamulja that were sick of living within Yaktel moved above the trees, and trade between the southern continent of Yoktural would bustle with its northern half, Shuktural. The Pelu Pelu no longer feared the subjugation of larger and stronger races, as the Hanu Hanu and Moblins improved upon their own cultures in new and creative ways. Which finally brings us to the present day. Tuliolal is now thriving, and thanks to the end of Garlemald's reckless wars and occupations, trade between Tural and the other continents may very well increase exponentially. After all, Shuktural is already becoming well known for its deep and plentiful reservoirs of ceruleum. But that doesn't mean Tural is suddenly lacking in mysteries. While we may have covered the land's history, there are things that even the locals don't know or understand. After all, Galul Jaja and his allies had discovered what drove the Yokhui to madness more than 1,000 years ago. He had discovered the entrance to the fabled City of Gold, and yet never really told anyone. Instead, he enlisted the aid of Galif Baldessian 20 years ago in researching it. But the tale of the Golden City is a story for another time. I hope your own travels within Tural go well, and that you have just as many memorable moments as Ketenram himself did. But until we meet again, as always, stay safe, my friends. Thank you all for watching. If you enjoy my content, it would mean the world to me if I had earned you as a subscriber. We are currently on the road to 50k, and I'd love to have you as part of that journey. I'd also like to take this time to thank my amazing Patreon supporters. Nanima, Amina Viltaria, Slippers, Ozkan Hawk, Naria O'Mara, Potato, Seth Rosewood, and Sinalv Bagel. Your support has always meant so much to me and helps to keep the content flowing with ease. If you're interested, there are additional links down in the description to my Discord, X, and other things as well. But until I see you again, I hope you're having an amazing day. Class dismissed.